Yes, and we are going live on YouTube as well. And I would like to say hello to all of our participants from all over the world who have joined us for the very first side event session today of the United Nations Virtual Forum on Responsible Human Rights, Business and Human Rights. And today we are at our very first side event, which is all about teaching business and human rights. And my name is Jasmine. I will be your technical facilitator from Inside Pact. My job is to ensure we have a great Zoom experience throughout the sessions. Our session will start in 2 minutes, and we're really looking forward to the session with our moderator as Justin today. And you will be able to ask your questions and upvote for the questions that you would like the panelists to answer in this session. So we just want to make sure it's really interactive, give you plenty of opportunity to share your thoughts with us. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Jasmine, shall we start the session now or a couple of more minutes?
Yes, let's start in 1 minute. It's in my time.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Justin. All right, it is time. So please join me in welcoming our moderator of today's workshop. Please join me, welcome Justin.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, and very warm welcome to everybody from all around the world to the UN's Virtual Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights. This is a side event for the forum, which officially kicks off tomorrow, but we are very excited that we are the first event of the forum, which has got really large numbers who have signed up, and I hope it'll be a really exciting week for everyone to participate in. It's disappointing that we can't all meet in person, but I think what it means is that we've probably got more people talking and collaborating than we might otherwise have had, and a much wider range of people from different regions. So this first session, which we're very grateful to the organisers for including, is on teaching business and human rights. And so our goal here is to basically collaborate with all your attendees, whether you're academics, civil society, from business, or from institutions, to talk about business and human rights education. So business and human rights itself is a very vibrant movement, and it has become a distinct field of practice and study. Yet, the demand for education is growing in this area. Many of the world's issues that education in this area focus from come from the Asia-Pacific region. But at the same time, there are really limited academic offerings on teaching business and human rights in the Asia-Pacific region. So this session is aimed at supporting educators, but much broader than that, other members of our community and stakeholders who are interested in talking about how we might integrate business and human rights into education, develop courses, or integrate them as part of mainstream studies. So I'm very excited and grateful that I'm moderating this session with some experts in the panel. So today I'm going to introduce you to our esteemed panelists, and then each panelist is going to have 5 minutes to talk about how they currently teach business and human rights. Then we're going to have about 35-minute discussion with the panel themselves, going back and forth about some of these major issues. And then we're going to have half an hour for attendees to contribute. The way that you'll contribute is through the Q&A function. That if you look pass your mouse across the main body of your screen, you'll see Q&A come up. And if you want to, by the time we get there, I'll remind you, but that's how you'll insert questions into it. So let's get started, and let me introduce our panelists today with it on teaching business and human rights. First up, we have Professor Surya Deva, who is based at the City University of Hong Kong and has been working in business and human rights field since early 2000. He would be very well known to many of you who are on this call. He has a special interest in developing rights holders-based approaches and exploring ways to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. He is also a member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and probably one of the busiest men in the field of business and human rights. Then we have Professor Sang-Soo Lee, who is based in Sogang University School of Law in Seoul, Korea. He delivers lectures on business and human rights and law, in addition to legal ethics and the sociology of law. He was previously the director of the Sogang Institute for Legal Studies and president of the Korean Society for the Sociology of Law. Then from India, we have Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan, who is a professor in organizational behavior based at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. She is wonderful to have on the panel, in part because many of the others are focused on teaching to lawyers, and Vasanthi in particular is going to talk about her courses and her role in educating business students on this particular issue. And then finally, we have from the UK, Dr. Tara Van Ho. She is based at the Essex School of Law and the Human Rights Centre there at the University of Essex. And she's also the co-president of the Global Business and Human Rights Scholars Association and a co-director of the Essex Business and Human Rights Project. She focuses on all issues around business and human rights, but has a particular focus on conflict and post-conflict states. So we've got this panel from Hong Kong, Korea, India, the UK, and Australia. And I know attendees from all over the region and around the world. So it's very, we're great that we can present this global perspective that is in particular going to focus on teaching business and human rights in a particular context in which we all do. So to start off, as I said, each panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes. And Surya, I'd like to invite you to start to talk about how you teach business and human rights and particular issues that you focus on. Thanks.
Thank you, Justine, and hello, everyone. It's great to be part of this panel, and I would like to share briefly my experience so far in teaching business and human rights. So I would like to do that in 3 parts. I would like to briefly talk about the context of my teaching. Secondly, I will refer to the content of the course that I teach. And finally, also briefly talk about the assessment. How do I do the assessment in this course? In terms of the context, so I started teaching this course at the law school at City University of Hong Kong in 2007. Yeah, that's a long time back. And I don't know, but I guess that not many law schools in the Asia Pacific or globally were teaching a standalone course on BHR in 2007. So probably it was early days, I would say, because even the UN guiding principles were not adopted at that particular point of time. I started this course as an elective course for LLB students, which are the undergraduate law students. But in the last few years, I also offered this to postgraduate law students, which is JD, comparable to US, Australia, or in Japan, or also master's student, LLM students. So, and the LLM course is now also part of an elective course in a specialized stream of LLM on corporate and commercial law. So I think that is the broad context. This is an elective course of 3 credits, 39 hours of teaching. And I teach it, I started more like a lecture and tutorial format, but now I do it more like a 3-hour seminar, which is an interactive seminar, and students have to read beforehand, and there are a number of activities going on. In terms of the content of the course, as I mentioned to you, 39 hours. So we have 13 teaching weeks in Hong Kong. The last week, I keep it for an exercise. or students asking some oral questions. So let us say we have 12 weeks of effective teaching. Out of these 12 weeks, what I do is I use the first 2 weeks to introduce a number of concepts which the student should know, the fundamental concepts. What is CSR? What is BHR? How are they different and all this? And then I move on to talk about what I have also articulated in my book, which is based on my PhD thesis, the 3 fundamental questions in the business and human rights. The first question is about why should businesses have human rights responsibilities? The second question is what are these responsibilities? What is the nature and extent of these responsibilities? And the third question is how to enforce these responsibilities. And this is a question about corporate accountability, access to justice, so on and so forth. Let me give a slight flavor of the kind of topics that I teach. In terms of why do we have these responsibilities, I touch upon the Burley Door debate, the very old debate, very famous debate. I discuss Milton Friedman and his critiques. And I also talk about the business case and the critique of the business case. I look at the UN guiding principles underpinning idea of social expectation, and other ideas, perhaps I would say a more sounder normative basis that why businesses should have human rights responsibilities or obligations in some cases. In terms of what is the nature and extent of these responsibilities of businesses, I look at a number of issues, whether it's about the parent and subsidiary responsibility issues, responsibility in the supply chain, what about companies operating in the conflict zone, issues about complicity. So these are the range of issues that I touch upon in this question of what. And finally, I talk about how, which is I look at number of soft standards, like of course UN guiding principles, but I also talk about the OECD guidelines, ILO declaration. I briefly talk about also the draft norms of 2003, Global Compact. I also take up case studies in terms of code of conduct. But I also devote some time to the litigation, especially the duty of care cases in the UK primarily, but also elsewhere in Europe and in Canada, all that. Now, finally, let me very quickly talk about assessment. Assessment, I do it in terms of class participation. In students present in classes, sometimes I ask them to pick any company they want and contrast what the company has done in terms of the commitment, in terms of the policy, and what the company is doing in terms of the practice. I also ask them to post their comments on the Canvas. Canvas is the platform that we use. I also have an assignment, which is about 30% of the course, in which I ask them either to develop kind of a strategy for a company, but in more recent times, I'm asking them to do a journal writing. So each student has to pick up 3 news items from 3 different weeks during the semester, and they have to do some short self-reflections on those 3 news items. And finally, there is an exam, including essay and hypothetical lab questions. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Arya. That's a great start to give us something to go from. So now I'm going to turn to Professor Sang-Soo Lee to talk for 5 minutes about his approach in Korea. Thanks, Sang.
Thank you very much. I'll talk. My teaching is very similar to that of Surya, and I have several places to teach business human rights. First one is at law school. Law school is much like American style legal education. It is established in the graduate level, and all of them, or most of them, will be lawyers. At that school, I opened at first I opened the corporate social responsibility and law. It was 2010, and it lasted until 2016. And my focus was moving toward more on the business human rights issues. And from 2017, I changed my lecture into business human rights. After that, my discussion in the classroom is mostly focused on the business human rights issues rather than corporate social responsibility. The contents of teaching is very inclusive. Every issue is discussed in my class. For example, some settings of PHR in terms of globalization and human rights violations. And we talk about global compact and norms on business human rights. And I spent a lot of time in understanding UN human rights, UN guiding principles. And we also talk about OECD guidelines and NCPs and ATCA. In this time, we are talking about complicity issues and extraterritoriality issues. And we talk about Dodd-Frank Act and the conflict minerals. And we also talk about French Duty of Vigilance Act and supply chain issues and public procurement. All of these issues discussed. And also various human rights treaties. And this class is open for the law school students. So we are talking about business human rights and the role of the lawyers and law firms in terms of business human rights. And we are talking about case studies, which happens in Korea. So I'm dealing all the issues, and the students are required to write some small essays, which they have interest in. So we did not have tests. We aside from the law school systems, we also had law department in the graduate school. I myself have 4 students. 3 is candidate for doctorate, and 1 is for master degrees. And they all have interest in business and human rights. And another thing I want to talk about is another chances to teach business human rights. Korean government requires all the public enterprises to practice business human rights in their organizations. So the number is about more than 800 organizations are required to do business human rights policies in their organization, which includes National Pension Fund or public enterprises for electricity, waters, gases, oils, or banks, broadcasting station. So all these organizations are required to practice human rights due diligence and remedial mechanisms. So they need to know, they want to know what does it mean by business human rights, and they want to teach their staffs and their own employees. So all those teaching processes, I am giving some advices, and sometimes I participate in the lecture itself. And another area I'm engaged with is with the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. They are providing lots of events, and they are making some education programs. And I also give them advices how to teach, what to teach. And I myself is also involved in teaching the persons who is from organizations or ordinary citizens or the students. And once I had the chance to make a video clip for the judges. The judiciary body wanted to teach the lawyers, the judges, to understand what is business human rights, and I recorded some video clips. It was about 5 clips, 5 hours. So it was my general working places, and I want to learn about how they teach it, and I want to have some interesting discussions from today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sang. And something we'll get to in a short time is also teaching beyond the university as well. So what other mechanisms are we all using to reach out sometimes to the profession, to civil society, because we're talking about here about education in quite a broad sense. So in particular, this opening question is focused on what each of these professors is doing at their university, but we will get to questions about how they're interacting with other organizations like the Human Rights Commission or business, etc. So our third in our opening presentations, I want to turn to Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan, who is based at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. Thank you, Vasanthi.
Thank you, Justin. I think at the outset, let me just I teach for the executives. Corporate executives, typically middle managers and senior managers. That's where I've been offering the sessions on business and human rights. But this December, I actually have designed a course that will be taught as an elective, a standalone elective to the second year students on the 2-year MBA program that we have. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to just outline what is it that I do with the executives, and also what has informed my design of the course on business and human rights. For the executives, I think very much on the lines of what Sang mentioned and Surya Deva mentioned, I think the large focus is on what is the responsibility of a corporation. And I think the distinction that I make, and that's where the law ends and where the ethical dimension of managing begins, is really when we talk of corporations as citizens, and therefore what are the implications in particularly countries like ours, where visible gaps in terms of access and opportunity exist. I think that piece then ties very nicely into the stakeholder framework. And once we get them to see the stakeholders, the difficulty that I have found there is transitioning to get them to look at rights holders. But fortunately for us, whether it is land acquisition that is happening for economic development, or whether it is the case of being a part of global supply chains, I think it gives us a nice segue into what is rights. And the advantage that we have is that everybody is familiar with the word because our constitution enshrines the fundamental rights. And then we kind of build and ask, what does it mean when you talk about rights of individuals? So this discourse, and therefore I close with a leadership perspective in terms of why companies have to engage with human rights. And this distinction I make particularly because CSR in India is mandated. And there's a certain percentage that companies have to donate. So I make this distinction between a social responsibility of business given the inequality to the ethical dimension of running a business, and thereby separate and link both of them to the SDGs. So that's what we do for the executives. I believe that a similar format has informed in the way I'm looking at the business and human rights course. I'm basically looking to begin with as a 1.5 credit course, which is really 15 classroom sessions. And the reason I'm doing this, because it is very unusual in our business school. We usually have a 3 credit, 30 sessions, 20 sessions, sorry, 1.5 hours. So the reason I did this, because I'm not confident that there are enough cases for me to be able to take into the classroom, but I expect that next year it will become a 3 credit course. So in the 1.5 credit course, I have basically 5 themes. The first theme that I'm working on is, why is it that managers have to look at business and human rights? And that's very similar to what I do with executives and the changing role of corporations. The second theme that I have is, where does the CSR debate and the human rights perspective differ? And then go on to identifying rights holders. I have chosen deliberately to focus on the UNGP with particular emphasis on due diligence. The reason is, I believe that young managers need to have tools and techniques to be able to go back when they get into organizations to inform and influence the organization. So I intend to spend a significant amount of time on the human rights due diligence process. And I also am going to spend time on looking at, where does it link or stray away from a risk management perspective? And therefore, how can they shape the narrative of risk management within the corporate conduct? And the last piece that I'm looking at is to sensitize them to the human rights impact assessment process, and then also look at, how do organizational processes the whistleblower policy, the code of conduct policy, the ombuds processes, the existing leadership norms and culture in the organization? How do they actually align to a larger canvas in which one can look at business and human rights? So these are broadly the themes around which I intend to anchor. Most of my courses are experiential in nature, and therefore the formats that I choose is 30% self-reflection. And I like the idea of what Surya just mentioned about a journal. So I'm going to kind of take that on. But the second one that I do is actually get them to do a value chain analysis of the organization's particular sectors, so that they have an understanding of the kind of human rights issues that come up in each of the sectors. And the third piece that I have is a kind of an open-ended case analysis, kind of an exam format. So this is broadly how I'm looking at assessment. I think the objectives of the course that I'm looking at right now are very simple and threefold: to create an awareness and a bit of an understanding on the business and human rights. The second one that we are looking at is to be able to equip them with tools and techniques. And third one is just to build a little bit of critical thinking on this whole area. Let me stop there for now, and maybe we'll come back in the next round.
Fantastic, Vasanthi. And that also gave us a really great insight, which we'll take up later, between, we can see some differences emerging between teaching law students and teaching business students. And so we'll take that up as we go along. So last but not least, in our final opening presentations, I'm going to turn to Dr. Tara Van Ho, who is based at Essex University and who is up at a very early hour. It's about, it's closer to 5:30, even though it looks like the middle of the day over there. So Tara, we really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to hearing about your teaching. Thanks.
Thanks, Justine. So at Essex, we have an LLM and an MA, we have separately 6 LLM and MA programs that are specific to human rights. And so we've been teaching business and human rights as part of these programs for about 20 years. I inherited them from my former mentor, Professor Sheldon, well, still my mentor, Professor Sheldon Leader. And it's taught first as a standalone class, but then it's also integrated into several core classes for each of the degrees. And increasingly it's integrated into as standalone sessions in classes outside of our degrees. Traditionally, our students have been human rights master students, but we've now opened it up to our commercial law side as well. So we have students who are doing their LLMs on commercial or trade law. And starting next year, I'm very excited. I think you guys are the first to hear this publicly, but it is up on the website that we will have an LLM in international law that's much more broader than our current LLM programs. And so our business and human rights class will be open to that. In addition to the business and human rights class, we have a class on investment, trade, and human rights, which follows our business and human rights class and then develops specifically how investment law and trade law impact on the rights of corporations versus the rights of individuals. I'm just going to focus on our standalone class for now. We start with issues, we start with sort of the broad range of issues and look through how businesses can impact on human rights in a variety of different ways and on the full range of human rights. We also spend a little bit of time at the beginning introducing human rights to the commercial lawyers and company law to the human rights lawyers, because even though we're dealing with postgraduate taught students, the reality is if, depending on where they did their degree, they might not have even had a class in human rights. And many of the human rights lawyers skipped their company law class. So we spend a little bit of time, the company lawyers, the commercial lawyers tend to come in with the idea that human rights is this instinctual belief system that we each have, rather than a set of required actions. We also, on the other side, have to explain to human rights lawyers what a corporate personality is, how companies function, what the role of managers and directors are. So we spend a little bit of time getting these two groups to talk to each other and to speak the same language. Once we have that down a little bit, we then move into the specifics, and we follow the structure of the UN guiding principles, although the content is much more diverse than what's in the guiding principles. So we start with the state duty to protect. What does that mean? And what do we expect states to be doing? This also leads to our single session on investment and trade law within our business and human rights course. And then when we do investment and trade, we also bring in a specific session on business and human rights norms. Then we move on to the business responsibility to respect, and there we're really looking at the policies and practices that we expect of businesses when they're functioning. And our hope here is that our company lawyers in particular, our commercial lawyers, will have a chance to think through what their roles are as in-house counsel. And then we move on to remedies, and this is our largest component of the module, where we go through the duty of care cases. We also look at the variety of different international and regional instruments that can be used to pursue human rights against businesses. And then we finish up with some special sessions. Traditionally, this isn't, sorry. Traditionally, this has included a session on Indigenous rights. Because I co-teach with Sheldon Leader now, we also do a session on his pet interest, which is big data and technology. So we're looking into increasingly at artificial intelligence and also data collection, how that works, and what businesses' responsibilities are specifically in the tech sector. And then we do my pet project, which is business and human rights in conflict and post-conflict situations. We assess the module traditionally by a 5,000 word assessment. Next year, because of the impact of COVID-19, we're going to be moving everything online. And rather than having students assessed by one thing, we're going to alter it so that there's a blog post that they'll write. And then our top students will have the opportunity to try to pursue publishing their blog post as part of our Human Rights Center blog. I have to admit that I recognize how lucky I am. I'm at a Human Rights Center specifically. We generally have 30 to 50 students in our business and human rights module. And increasingly, as I said, we're being asked to deliver this content to a variety of other disciplines. Within our own course, because it includes our MA students, there are a lot of students who aren't lawyers at all. So we have a lot of people who are sociologists or historians or government political scientists. It creates a lot of interesting dynamics within the classroom. It also creates a lot of frustration as a teacher when you're trying to get everyone to speak the same language. So I'm looking forward to having a little bit of a chance to talk about that in the future. And as Justine said, I think everyone who teaches in this area teaches to various audiences outside of the classroom. So I'm also looking forward to talking about how we work with civil society or the summer schools that Justine, Surya, and I know all teach on. So thanks, Justine.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you for setting the scene. Just before we go on, let me remind any attendees, if you would like to submit a question for when we get to our discussion forum for the last 25 minutes, please submit that through the Q&A box. I see that some of you are submitting chats, which is fine for a continuing conversation, but if there's a specific question you would like us to answer when we get to the discussion, please put it in the Q&A box for it. But the discussion that's happening in the chat box is a very rich one, so I encourage you to follow along with that as well. One of the first questions I'd like to ask the panelists is, you're all teaching in very different parts of the world, and there's been commonality in each of your courses, that there might have been a different approach. In particular, I was struck by the way that Vasanthi was talking about a leadership angle. Lawyers often lead more around obligations and rights and compliance angle as well. But we sort of get to the same point. But I would be interested in hearing from each of you about the particular countries and cultural contexts we're living with, how you might adapt or change that course. And one thing I'm thinking, for example, is that I'm based in Australia. And last week, you may have seen one of our companies, Rio Tinto, blew up a cave which housed Indigenous, which was a site of Indigenous sort of artifact for more than 46,000 years. Now, the process they did that was a legal process, but it raises questions around structural inequalities around that particular issue and the case study for informed consent. So that provides me in Australia with a ready-made case study that I would have to include, when I'm teaching, partly because of that particular context. So perhaps, Surya, given you're in the heart of a Hong Kong, where there's been many, interesting developments and protests over the last couple of years. Are there particular case studies you use or a particular approach you use in teaching your course that conveys your particular cultural context?
Thanks, Justine. Very good question. I use a number of tools. One thing I do quite frequently is I use newspaper clippings in my course. So many of these developments that you're talking about, which are relevant for the local context, because I don't teach a course based on a book, because things evolve very fast as the semester is progressing. So of course I have fundamental ideas and I have readings and all this, but my course evolves as things develop around me. And I think that is something which students enjoy, because I don't teach in a compartment or in a silo of a classroom. I teach them in the context of what is happening in the world. And of course, the local context, because most of the students in my class are either from Hong Kong or from mainland China, though I get some exchange students from Europe and Australia sometimes, and Canada as well. So I pick up case studies globally. I have to be careful that I pick case studies in a manner that the students may have a different opinion about human rights. Let us say one topic I teach is complicity of companies with certain governments and regimes. And one of the case studies that I take is internet censorship in China. So there are mainland students. So I don't avoid the question, because this is a real question. But I teach it in a way that they can understand different views and opinion on this. And I think we normally have a live debate. In the context of the protest, one case study which is quite relevant, for instance, is Cathay Pacific. As you may recall, for Cathay Pacific, some of the employees were fired simply because they posted some messages supporting democracy on Facebook. So I think that is a very interesting case study, because Cathay Pacific commits, it has a code of conduct, it commits to respect human rights and all this. But I think how it has operated in practice, in my view, is not consistent with that. So I think that will be a very dynamic case study, which I hope to use in future when I teach this course. So I keep on building on these case studies. Thank you.
Prasanthi, what about you in India? Is there a particular focus you take with what you teach? Prasanthi, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I think I just want to lay out probably the multiple contexts that one has to engage with when one is teaching in India. I think the first one is that when you look at the composition of our businesses, we have the multinationals, we have the large listed companies, but we have a large number of unlisted and family-owned businesses. And then we have the small and medium enterprises. So I think the heterogeneity of the context means that there are some of them who are under pressure from global standards and global operating ways, which makes it very different in terms of how you engage with them, to several local companies which are very large, but really are under no pressure from, not as much of a pressure as they would from the domestic consumers. So I think this is important to understand as a context. The second one that's important to understand is that there is such a dominant stakeholder mindset, which I think comes in the way of a rights holder perspective. And I know it's going to be controversial, but I'm still going to lay it out, because I think the business discourse, given its origins in agency theory and transaction cost economics, I think has a particular way of how it looks at stakeholders. And I think when we come to talk of rights holders, we have to challenge the beliefs that actually organizations have created over the last 2 decades on stakeholders. So how then does one talk about rights holders? So what are the 2 or 3 contentious issues post-COVID that are going to come into this human rights course, whether we like it or want it or don't? First one is migrant labor. Whose responsibility is migrant labor? How far in the supply chain do corporations have accountability? How do you go beyond standards which are global in nature, so there is a leverage available through which global suppliers control supply chains? How long, how far, and how much can that happen? There has to be a kind of consciousness in terms of actually looking at how do we take that rights perspective when we look at domestic businesses where there are really no such levers or pressure from consumers. So I think what's becoming clear is one, migrant issue. The second challenge that we have faced is vulnerable groups, disempowered groups who have no access and opportunity. How do we actually discuss what is the role of business there? The third one, land acquisition and land rights, is another contentious issue. And last but not the least, gender. With the weak economic empowerment of women in the Indian context, I think gender rights is another one that legitimately businesses have to kind of confront. So I'm not sure if that is making sense, but I think what I want to leave is that when we are designing a business and human rights course in a country like this, with multiple rights holders reality where corporations infringe on, how then do you actually look at this complex context? I think that's the point I'd like to leave for now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm just going to build in another question, and Sang and Tara, if you want to answer both at once when we get to you, that's no problem at all. But one of the other questions that comes up alongside the cultural context is how we reach out beyond just the university sector as well. And in all of your opening comments, you started to talk about other ways and other forums in which you teach. Sang, for example, you talked about interactions with the Korean Human Rights Commission. Do you want to talk a little bit about this in terms of Korea, how you reach out, and any other particular cultural aspects you would like to discuss?
Thank you very much. And I think I'm very much emphasizing the importance of UN guiding principles. UN guiding principle itself is not binding rules, but I think the guiding principle itself has very strong ideas, moral powers, and it should be utilized as it is. I want to show how guiding principle is working. That is very important. It is not just legal issues. So in that sense, I'm giving you some examples I use in my classroom. There was big workplace injuries in Hyundai Heavy Industry. It's Korean shipbuilding company. And there's lots of persons was killed. And how to solve it? Government do not responded. Media not responded. In this case, we approached to the Norwegian pension fund. We complained that company, that pension fund, and their staff came to the places, to the shipbuilding places, and they make inspection. So this kind of thing is how the UN guiding principle is working. And sometimes we approach to the Maersk. This is the ship ship buyer. They are ordering some ships to the heavy industry. So we attack the buyers to influence the in the field. So that is how it works. And the UN guiding principle is mostly useful in attacking the human rights violation happens in the medium and small size companies. So that is, I think, very important. So normally people, as Basanti said, she is emphasizing the moral persuasion to the CEOs. But I think we have to prove how UN guidance principle is working for the person who is suffering. They need some kind of teaching, how they can take advantage of the UN guiding principles, why it is useful. So I think we have to approach to the victims, and we have to teach them how they can take advantage of UN guiding principles. In that sense, I use some cases of a Korean shipbuilding company.
Thank you very much, Sang. So this question about how we extend our sort of business and human rights education beyond those who voluntarily come to us. Tara, you're also co-president of the Global Business and Human Rights Scholars Association. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and its global impact?
Sure, thanks, Justine. So the Global Business and Human Rights Scholars Association is one of the largest organizations specific to people who are working in research capacities on business and human rights. Every year we have an annual conference and it moves around. Next year, it was supposed to be this year, we were in Mexico. With COVID-19, we've postponed that trip to 2021. And this is really an opportunity for us to bring together particularly early career researchers, so PhD students can join, along with a variety of people from different continents who are able to work together to talk through how we teach, but also how we bring our scholarship into that teaching. We work very closely with another organization that's specific to people who are teaching, which is Teach Business and Human Rights Forum. And you can find us on our website, and we link to Teach BHR through our website. And having that global community actually really informs how I teach. At Essex, while we're based in the UK, most of our students are not British. Every year we have about 100 students come to us for human rights postgraduate education. Of that, usually 6 are from the UK. So we tend to allow our students to really talk to us about which cases they want for us to cover. The exceptions to that are when we get into either big data and technology or issues of conflict and post-conflict. Then we choose our own cases. But last year we had a lot of students from Thailand, like an unusually high number of students from Thailand, and they really drove our conversations about business responsibility towards refugees and migrant workers, business responsibility in supply chains, and also issues of equality and non-discrimination, particularly along gender and sexual identity, gender identity and sexuality. So we allow them to kind of set forth this pattern. And when that happens, I really rely on the network of scholars that we have in the Global Business and Human Rights Scholars Association to kind of help me think through a lot of those issues. And I think having that international network has proved really important for me as I continually reassess how we're teaching this issue. So while the general structure stays the same, the content that goes into our weekly sessions changes every year. Like Syria, we use a lot of real life examples that we pull from newspaper articles or blog posts or case discussions. Knowing where those resources are, knowing how to get access to them, it really needs that sort of international community, because I am very limited in my language skills. I speak English. I can read other languages, but really being able to access that stuff, we rely heavily on the scholars community to help us push that forward. In terms of how we reach out to other people, I mean, I'm assuming Surya will at some point discuss his intense course that Justine and I have both taught on. I also teach on an intense summer school in Italy that takes place over 1 week. Essex has in the past run our own sessions as part of our Human Rights Methods summer school. And then I tend to work really closely with non-governmental organizations and civil society. And they bring me in for either one-off sessions to talk through specific issues, often associated with conflict or post-conflict, or to come in for a couple of days to work through issues. We are open to doing that for businesses as well. We haven't actually been approached by any businesses who want these intense sessions, but we are open to doing that. And for us as academics at a human rights heavy institution, having an ongoing relationship with businesses is quite tricky for us. We have had issues in the past where businesses have come to us with less than pure intentions. But when it comes to training, that's a very easy way for us to partner with businesses, and we're always open to that. And we think that it's really important that businesses have that kind of ongoing, continuous learning on these issues. So in terms of how can we reach out to the broader business community, what is our role as scholars and teachers? that I think is an area that we really need to develop more of. And I think there are some people within our global scholars community that do that really well. And I think it's a place that we have a responsibility to really work with businesses in that specific way, because when it comes to sort of evaluating your policies and processes, that gets a lot trickier for universities. But when it comes to sort of teaching you what to do or working through real life case studies, that's a really easy way for us to partner. And it's something that our civil society partners that we value deeply, they get a little antsy if we get into some of the other stuff, but they're really supportive of us when it comes to that kind of training and outreach.
Thank you. And Surya, just before, after this one, we're going to open it up to the Q&A because there's so many questions that have already come through. But Surya, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about teaching beyond your sort of university setting. You and I both teach in, often teach in programs from the Diplomacy Training Program, DTP, in Asia Pacific region, but you do that and other things, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about broader reach in teaching business and human rights.
Thanks, Justine. I strongly believe that we need to build a tremendous amount of capacity on the ground of not only students, but also lawyers, business executives, government officials, civil society, trade unions, everyone, when it comes to business and human rights. And it is not enough for us to teach only our students at the law schools or business schools. So with that objective in mind, I started what I called Human Rights and Business Academy, HURBA, in 2016, before I joined the working group. The idea of this HURBA initiative was to create a mobile course in which we do not bring in students, rather we bring in experts to close to students in different parts of the world, especially the global south. So we started doing this course in India, and we're doing it only once in a year because I got very busy with the working group, so I don't have enough time. But hopefully once I finish with the working group, I'm going to devote more time on that. Because I believe that unless we build this capacity, like how many experts, academia, people we have in Asia Pacific, Justine, if we take out Australia and was part of Asia Pacific, very handful, who can independently write and teach on business and human rights issues. How many in Asia Pacific? How many of these are influencing the business and human rights discourse at the global level? Very few. And that's why I would like to build that capacity more. So 3 things that I'm trying to do. One is this HURBA courses, and please watch out for this. This is going to be virtual this time, 6th to 10th of July. And both Justine and Tara will be part of that course. So we'll release it tomorrow, the curriculum and who will be teaching what. Second, I would like to build a momentum and bring together the academics in Asia Pacific working on BHR, and I'm planning a workshop, let us say first half of 2021 in Hong Kong, if it works out in terms of COVID travel and all that. That is the second thing I want to do. I want to create a network which is not global, association like Tara. But if you look at Tara Global Association, Asia Pacific voices in that association, I'm sure are very, very tiny. So what I'm trying to do in Asia Pacific is going to build and contribute to that global association. And the third point is do something what I will call train the trainers. So instead of teaching merely the students and building the capacity, I would also like to create some short dialogue-based peer learning about the people who are teaching courses, like this kind of a seminar. So we build the capacity around pedagogy and how do we do it better. Learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we've got so much interaction now from the attendees, we've nearly got 200 people online, I'm going to just pick some questions. And the panel, we all won't get to speak to answer every question. If there's something you really would like to speak, please jump in. But it might be that one person answers so we can get through a few of them because we've got quite a few questions. One of the questions up the top is around the sort of the focus on what you teach. Do you think the debate on business and human rights has focused too much on responsibility and less on developing adequate remedies? Remedies seem to be rare. Should we be focusing on this more in what we teach? Sorry, I'm just going to go back to you quickly because I know this is a big part of what you do around remedies. So perhaps you've got a brief response to that one.
In fact, and I'm speaking my personal capacity, I will entirely agree with this. And I was supposed to give a talk at Essex last year or this year. I don't, early this year, Essex.
March.
Yeah,
2020.
and the talk was that how do we bring back rights in BHR? Because my view is that BHR landscape is devaluing the idea of rights. And because if we do not have rights, we do not have remedies. So I personally believe very strongly, and I teach in my course, remedies and accountability is a key component. This is not a voluntary wish-wish thing that you do it for business case or something. To me, human rights are non-negotiable preconditions of doing business, period. And if you breach those preconditions, you must face the consequences in terms of remedies, which are effective. So I teach that, and I think we need to do more on that.
Yeah. Tara, Justin, can I just add to that? In fact, the biggest challenge in when you're teaching this in the business context is really to accentuate the protect and remedy piece, because the tendency is to focus on the respect, and that's probably the toughest session also, where you turn around and say, what does it mean to be complicit? Okay. So I think the access to remedy piece in the business curriculum, I think we just need to deepen that more. Yeah, completely with what Surya said. Thank you. Yeah.
There's a question here, and I'm going to direct it to you, Sang, to start with. How has your experience been in teaching topics on human rights? Are governments and businesses seeing the importance of these being taught by the education sector? What's your perspective of that from Korea?
Please ask on. Please ask a little bit. What was the question, please?
In part because I think when you were talking about your course, you said originally you focused around the concept of CSR, yes. And now you name it business and human rights. And so, what's the relevance of that? You know, is human rights a topic that's easily accepted as taught around this issue in Korea, or is it better framed as CSR to reach a broader audience?
Yes, I understand. I'm sorry. I think these two perspectives is very different from each other, and the business human rights is much more fit me and to the law school students, and that is not just a matter of me or my law school students' interest. I think to solve the issue itself, how we attack the human rights violations all over the world, the corporate social responsibility is not enough. So the mechanism is different. So I think the human rights mechanism is business human rights mechanism much better, and especially the UN guiding principle is very important. It is very persuasive. It's a completeness, or its way is very original, and it is not be found in other places. In the sense that, for example, a former person asked about the remedy. A remedy can be integrated in the UN guiding principles. It is not just talking about the remedy from the judicial bodies. The remedy itself is integrated in the human rights management or human rights due diligence itself. The human rights idea itself provides some remedies. As I told you, the person who is suffering from the small companies, they can make a complaint, not direct his own owners, his own employers. He can complain this issue to the Samsung or Hyundai Heavy Industry or other outside companies. It is very powerful. It is working. So whenever I am teaching about the UN guiding principles or business human rights mechanisms, I spent a lot of time to persuade this is not a matter of individual companies. It is working together. If there's some companies, if there's at least 5 or 10 companies in Korean company who is committed to the business human rights values, then whole society can be changed because they all influence other companies. So they are interconnecting. So the person who is suffering from the human rights violations, they have to learn how to use these mechanisms. So it is how we increase the social pressures to the companies and to make it work the guiding principle mechanisms. So that is my idea. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question I'm going to direct to both Vasanthi and Tara, and it comes from Dorothea Baumann-Pauli in Switzerland. How do the panelists ensure that their business and human rights classes are not isolated in just either their business or law program? Do you show that your classes link up with the rest of your program? And she's also interested in hearing about how business and human rights education capacitates students to actually manage human rights in practice, perhaps beyond human rights due diligence. So that question about sort of not being siloed first. Tara, do you want to start, and then Vasanthi?
Sure. Hi, Doro. It's nice to sort of virtually see you. So we first of all have a couple of core survey courses that go across all of our degrees. And when we do that, then we bring in a business and human rights specific one. And we sort of, you have to be, when you're doing those standalone courses, you have to be aware of what comes before and after you. And so we situate that discussion within that context. Depending on which program I'm teaching to, and depending on which discipline the majority of students come from, that can take a variety of different ways. So when I'm speaking to our MA students in particular, when I'm speaking to students in different disciplines, whether that's government or sociology or history, I tend to start with a historical understanding of how corporations and the notion of a corporate personality developed, how our economic infrastructure and our current approaches, our current global dominant approaches address business and human rights. And then I move into business and human rights as a framework at the end. And that's intended to sort of make sure that the students are making these connections between what we're currently talking about and what they're studying either across their degree or specifically within that module. When it comes to thinking of how do you manage this practically and on the ground, at Essex, we pride ourselves in talking about how we train the plumbers of human rights, right? The people who go out and actually do and fix the human rights problems in the world. And now that's a massive aspiration, and I'm not going to suggest that that you know, if you come to Essex, you're going to solve all of the world's economic problems, although you might. So come on over anyways. But what we really try to emphasize is, what does this look like in practice? And so all of our modules and all of our courses are designed around that specific thing. Like, how do you take these vague aspirations that we've developed, work them into practical legal instruments, and then how do you take that and implement them in practice? So this goes back to the question about remedies. Because we're primarily training human rights lawyers and we're not training business operators or managers or directors, we're looking a lot at remedies, right? So that's a primary tool in which human rights defenders are able to raise these cases. We look at, what does that mean? We look at, how do you set up non-judicial remedies? What are the roles and responsibilities of civil society in working with businesses when they want to do that? And what are the limits of that as well? Because there is some natural tension generally between what businesses want out of non-judicial remedies and what civil society wants out of non-judicial remedies. So we work through that in practice. I think, I want to hear what Justine and Surya say, but I think generally speaking, people who work in this field and who teach in this field have to be really practically oriented. The problems are too big for aloof thinking. And if you're not really being on the ground with your teaching, you're missing serious numbers of issues. The guiding principles are great for what they are, but they are not the start and end of the discussion for business and human rights. The start and the end are in these practical cases that come up. The guiding principles fit into those practical cases, but they shouldn't be the thing that consumes us as scholars or as teachers.
Thanks, Tara. Vasanthi, would you like to add to that? Vasanthi, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. What are the two? So there are 3 courses that most of our students would have taken on the MBA program. The first is what we have a core course, which is Business, Government and Society. And there is a module there which actually brings in the rights perspective. And that section is actually taught by the lawyer, our professor who's from the legal perspective. So that kind of becomes the foundation. In the sustainability and environment sustainability, climate change, they take a rights perspective. And very interestingly, the corporate governance, which is another entry point, particularly for the executives when we teach, corporate governance is a compulsory module. And in the corporate governance, fortunately for us, the Companies Act, the India Companies Act in 2013 has legitimized stakeholders. And we've had disclosures for the last 10 years from the companies. And one of the disclosures pertains to the performance on business and human rights. So what allows us to be able to integrate to the rest of what's happening on the campus is really those levers. The corporate governance, we just expand that lever, call out on the fiduciary responsibility of leadership, boards, as they kind of disclose on the human rights, and then call out asking, what does it mean when you actually are disclosing on that? And how does this differ from your CSR disclosures? And I think that's a nice conversation that we do there, which kind of integrates. And on the standalone course, I think given the stage of evolution of the course, I believe that in at least South Asia for some time, we need enough scholars who can do the standalone course for us to build capacity to then go out and integrate it with the remaining courses. Yeah.
Thanks, Vasanthi. I have a question to you, Surya, that comes from Jolene Ong. Interested to hear how your course might adapt in the future in a post-pandemic world. Are there particular business and human rights issues you might focus on?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. So I see COVID-19 as surfacing the issues which we had put under the carpet. Like COVID is non-discriminatory, the virus. It is affecting all of us. But how we are resilient to it, how we are able to live in a lockdown situation is not the same. I, as a professor, can work from home, but a construction worker cannot. Many women are experiencing more domestic violence at home because they are forced to work from home, right? The level of inequality that we have and the level of poverty we have had is going to be made worse because of COVID, but these things have been there with us. So in my view, COVID-19 is a wake-up call to all of us, including BHR scholars and practitioners, that whatever we have been trying to do in the last 20, 30 years, in the name of BHR, is very, very superficial, very little, and very slow. We are not asking questions to make fundamental transformations. So I will try to integrate those ideas in my course in terms of climate change, artificial intelligence, in terms of poverty, inequality. In brief, that is my response. Thank you.
So I look forward to you solving the world's greatest problems this year and next year. Thank you, Surya, for that. Here's a question to you, Tara. The problem with lecturing business on human rights is that they don't take commercial decisions on that basis. How receptive are commercial lawyers to human rights issues? And how receptive do you find human rights lawyers to commercial preoccupations? That one comes from Steve.
So thanks, Steve. The first day when we go through what is a company, what are human rights, there's a significant gap between the company lawyers, commercial lawyers, and the human rights lawyers. The company lawyers assume that they can figure out human rights by their own instincts. And then when we talk about the laws, they kind of get overwhelmed because they don't really understand, what is this progressive realization thing? How do you measure developments in things like the right to health or the right to adequate conditions of work? And the human rights lawyers on the other side are overwhelmed by the notion that businesses don't take into human rights, because for them, that's the natural starting point for any question that you're going to answer is, what are the human rights at issues? And if there aren't any human rights at issues, which is extraordinarily rare, but it happens particularly in the commercial setting, if somebody's selling widgets for $1,000 and suddenly they want to jack up the price to $1,200, that's not a human rights issue, generally speaking, although it can have human rights dimensions. And so thinking through it and getting them to talk to each other is really difficult. By the end of the class, what I tend to find is that the company lawyers are actually much more radical than the human rights lawyers in the end. And I don't really know if that's how we teach or if that's just the natural development of people once they start to understand what human rights are. So I'd be interested in hearing from Vasanti how her business students take this. But our commercial law students tend to, in the end, really embrace the responsibility of businesses for human rights. And they're the ones who are actually pushing for clearer regulation and clearer remedies. It's by the end of the class, our human rights students are sometimes a little despondent. They're like, oh, this is overwhelming, right? Like corporate personality, how it separates and shields businesses from liability, how the entire global economic system is structured to benefit corporations over human rights. How are we going to fix this? And the commercial lawyers are the ones who are saying, actually, we need clear regulation. Every company should be taking this on board. Every company should be embedding this into their practices. And the only way you're going to get that is if you have clear regulation and clear remedies. So they really become quite, they really embrace these issues. When I teach outside of my department, it gets, that radical shift doesn't happen as quickly. And so I do find that when I'm teaching either in these one-off courses or when I'm working with civil society to educate businesses, that radical shift doesn't happen as quickly. Businesses are still, the default is still one in which you focus on the commercial interests. And I think that that's a matter of habits. I've been studying a ton on habits lately and how we develop them. And the reality is if you've done something one way for, if we're talking about business, we're talking about hundreds of years that businesses have followed a particular path and a particular set of steps. And that habit is not just individual businesses or business leaders, but it's sociologically embedded into all of the business education around the world. That changes, that it's difficult to change those habits on an individual or on a collective basis. And so it's really about helping people establish new habits and getting them to understand how you can do that in a really common sense way within business operations.
Tara, let me just kind of jump on, and I thought that was great what you said, because over the last year, I've been working on a research project on having these conversations with business. And I see three sets of challenges there. The first is, of course, that they get overwhelmed with the rights perspective. I think they just don't know how to cope and process with the overlap that exists between the legal requirements and the compliance to the managerial and ethical, and then, of course, the institutional perspectives. So I think I have seen that right across the board, from the CEO of the company right down, it's a challenge. And one of them has actually asked the question on the chat, so it kind of also makes it easier in response to that. At the middle management level, I find that they don't have the tools to translate. So which means even if their bosses come up with these grand ideas, they don't know how to execute it. And the best example is supply chain audits. And over, it keeps surfacing everywhere. And the third one is that, and this is the most difficult one in business school, is that we don't want them to get cynical. We don't want them to turn helpless. We want them to be empowered when they leave our classes, okay? And how do you kind of link the idea of societal issues related to human rights and bring them down to our organization and where they are kind of at the intersection, and then say, what is the role that I, as a manager or a leader, have to play within this context? I think the biggest challenge for all of us now, as I listen to you, is how do we actually empower them to be able to make those shifts at whichever level they are in the organization and to whatever degree they can influence. And I think that's something that we need to be more mindful of, because we are actually cracking the habits, Tara. We just, kind of cracking them. How do we break them and kind of empower? I think all of us as teachers are going to confront that question sometime or the other. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasanthi. Sang, there's a couple of questions on the chat, which I'm sort of trying to combine into one, but a lot of them talk about, some of them talk about corporate purpose and the need to discuss that when you teach. And also many of them are dwelling on a distinction between CSR and business and human rights. And I'd like to start with Sang and then go back to Vasanthi. Sang, when you teach your law students this subject, to what extent is it focused on a really legal perspective, or is it broader than that when you teach? Sang, you're on mute, if you just unmute.
Actually, when I teach the law students who will be a lawyer in near future, but the problem is that we have to make the law itself to teach it. So we do not have the law currently. And actually in the classroom, I'm teaching the law of foreign countries and how they are making. And we are discussing what kind of law is actually needed. So that is a kind of a dilemma and some kind of a very cynical aspect of it. But I want to add some other aspects which is being discussed. We in Korea, many public enterprises, public corporations, they are required to do business human rights practices. They are required to business human rights due diligence, and they are required to practice human rights impact assessment. The problem we feel is that society is not so much changed. It is not to feel that the actual change has happened, and the person who is suffering from the business activities, they do not get benefit from these policies. So what is the reason between these gaps? Is it the reason why the CEO of the public enterprises do not understand human rights or do not understand the business human rights practices? But I think that it is not the question of whether they understand the idea of these human rights or BHR or mechanisms. Rather, they do not feel the need to practice that kind of practices. So they do not any practices to realize, to actualize the government policies. So that is the gaps. They need some kind of triggering actor is needed. So so that is our current point of issues we are discussing in these issues among the professors and among the NGOs. So how we can pressure them. That is the important aspect. And in the law schools, some 2-3 months ago, I had a chance to talk about legal issues at law firms. There was about 60 persons who was there, and they were interested in how to address as a law firm to the business human rights issues. What I have done is only it is the time to address these issues, and the idea is that lawyers are not limited their activities to the legal issues. They should understand human rights risks. The human rights risk and the legal issue is very much mixed. And the lawyers also should understand not just the legal issues, but also human rights issues. So when I'm teaching in the law schools, I also emphasize that your work will not be limited in the legal issues. Of course, if there's a law on business human rights laws, then your work will be expanded. But before that, you also have to take care of the human rights risk of the companies. And in advising big companies, you should prepare yourself in terms of business human rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Sang. Vasanthi, just before we go to another question, predominantly business and human rights is still taught in law schools, and that, there's some business schools in the US and Europe now, and yours in India and other parts of Asia, but it's not as common. And so how do you see a way of advancing business and human rights education and getting more business schools on board on this? You just need to unmute yourself first. Basanti, if you unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Let me, so I think business schools in general have been quite late in joining the, whether it is the sustainability discourse or whether it was the ethics and corporate responsibility discourse. I think it's only when they face consequences that they actually begin to engage with the idea. So I think that I want to lay out that point because the gap between occurrences of violations to the time that they are actually fined and then by the time they actually begin to get converted, that journey has been very long. So in some ways, I think the CSR journey of the last 20 years has got so deeply embedded that it has brought in a certain kind of thinking, which is protecting the interest of the corporation. So the entire CSR discourse is about stakeholder management. To me, that is the challenge to a human rights conversation. And for business schools to be able to kind of break that, to actually talk about who are we leaving behind in the way we do business? Who are we likely to impinge on most severely? I think that is the question where I actually begin to see reflection begin. So in a way, there is a desensitization that has happened through the CSR discourse. So if we have to get that, then probably the starting point is really who are the people who don't have access to remedy to the violations that businesses create? I think is probably the starting point to make that transformation. Having said that, what can business schools do? I think there are 2 or 3 ways that I see them be an active agent. The first, I think, is that if we expand the role of business and look at it from a management school, then we have to bring in the government and the civil society in the human rights conversation. And it's about effectively managing the enterprise, not necessarily effectively doing business. It might appear as a word play, but it's the shift between short-term and long-term thinking. And I think many business schools are already headed in that direction. And I think that's a place for business and human rights to get anchored. The second way that business and human rights can get anchored is that I think professors who teach marketing actually have now begun talking of consumer rights. And I think the consumer right and environment right, which is already legitimate as a conversation or getting legitimacy as a conversation, could well be the trigger point that why consumer rights and what does that mean for the corporation. And I think that's a nice way that business schools can very quickly come into the discourse. The third and the last one that has been of concern, but is that I think not enough lawyers and business school professors are having conversations. And where am I coming from? Because I was a part of the advisory committee on looking at the business and human rights issues that was set up by the ministry. And I remember my colleague from the business, from the law and me, the amount of time we spent in just making sense of the law in a way that managers can understand. I think those conversations we need to do more of between the business school and the law school, because law school has a history with working with rights and business school is a new player there.
Fantastic points. That'd be wonderful if we could do all of that. One of the first things I ask my students to do is to ban them from ever using the word journey. Because I always find that business is on a very long journey to human rights, which they never seem to get there, but they're on a very quick journey to making money. So we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask the panelists you have a very short time, less than a minute each, to give your final thoughts. And one of the topics I would like you to discuss, is there's a number of questions around from students, is are there careers in business and human rights? What can people do with all this education? Where might they go? And any final thoughts you have, but if you could keep it to under a minute. Surya, to you first.
I think yes. Let me respond to this question about the career. I think there are multiple opportunities. I see potential roles in the media sector, both in print media as well as newspaper journalists. We need a lot of lawyers who can, of course, work for many companies, and many law firms, international law firms in particular, they have the BHR or CSR section in the law firm. But I would like to think of lawyers also defending human rights, not merely companies. So I would like to produce every year some lawyers who can sacrifice some dollars, but they are willing to stand for rights, not for companies, because there are plenty of lawyers defending companies. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we need lawyers to defend rights holders, in my view. We also need people to advise governments, because there's a huge lack of capacity, as well as companies. And again, if these people could be rights-based, I think that would be a game changer in my view. So my suggestion to everyone is that let us bring back rights and rights holders at the center of BHR. Unless we do that, we're merely doing a superficial treatment, window dressing, to sustain the system which is broken. Thank you.
Thank you. Sang, any quick final comment from you? You just have to unmute yourself first.
I'm totally agree with Surya, and I want to add something. Today, many questions is about the difference between CSR and BHR. These two are actually very much overlapping, but I think the BHR approach is much better because most important reason is that we have UN guiding principles. Because we have it and we have very much widely agreed on these ideas. I did not spend much time why we have to respect, why we have to use these words. I do not spend much time what kind of ways is needed. I only explain the UN guiding principles. This gives you our vision, our method. So it is very perfect text. So this kind of very authoritative text does not exist in the field of corporate social responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vasanthi, any words from you?
Yeah, I think if we are able to get more people to embrace the business and human rights discourse, forget about the careers, but just the perspective, I think South Asia needs, whether it's at civil society, whether it's in the business, whether it's in the government, whether it's in the Human Rights Commission, I think we just need a perspective and orientation more than careers at this point in time.
Perfect. Thank you. And Tara?
So I think COVID-19 has exposed the fact that our economies are just not set up for handling these kinds of crises. Not just our national economies, but the global economy isn't set up for this. And that's one crisis. We're going to hit a slew of more crises as climate change picks up. So business and human rights is really integral to thinking through those issues and thinking through how do we create sustainable economies that address issues like climate change, address issues like the impact of COVID on migrant workers and on manufacturers throughout the world. If we can start to integrate that, you're going to see that the careers open up. As Vasanthi said, I think it's about exposing the perspective, because once you expose the perspective, the careers follow. There are careers still now. You can find careers in business and human rights in non-governmental organizations and intergovernmental organizations. There is a lot of academic research that is needed in this area, and I find increasingly that people are looking for business and human rights academics. And then obviously there are companies and auditors. There's an entire business, Surya talks about it as a business of business and human rights. There's an entire business and industry out there now of people who are looking at how do you audit for human rights? How do you take these ideas and translate them? So the careers are there. Sometimes they're there as established careers. Sometimes they're there as things that you can create your own career in. And so I agree again with what Vasanthi said. If we can sort of start to embed this discourse and language as one of the primary ways in which we address these crises like climate change and COVID-19, we're going to see an entire avenue open up for our students.
Well, thank you so much for all of your really fantastic insights in that. And thank you very much to the attendees from all over the world. I can see that we've had many from Asia Pacific, from Europe, from the US, from Somalia I saw, and probably other parts of Africa, Latin America, and all different times of the day. So we really appreciate your input. I apologize that we didn't get to all of your questions, but we really value your participation. And you should feel free to reach out to any of us if you have particular questions, which you'll find us all on our university websites. I'd like to thank in particular the 5 UN agencies who are organizing this forum. But in particular, I'd like to thank UNDP and Harpreet from the Bangkok office who pulled this session together. And thank you, Tara, for helping me organize it as well. So thank you to everybody behind the scenes. Thank you to the panelists. And we look forward to a wonderful week of discussions and to really the growth of business and human rights education throughout Asia. And we hope that next year when we have a similar panel, that there are about 20 panelists that we're choosing from all over Asia and Pacific. Thank you very much, Surya, Sang, Vasanti, and Tara. I look forward to seeing the rest of you as we interact this week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.